Jalen had always imagined that space travel would feel either majestic or terrifying, but the first thing he noticed about the Aurora's edge was the smell, a mixture of recycled air, burnt coffee, and something faintly metallic that made his stomach do little somersaults. He adjusted the straps of his harness, muttering under his breath about how he'd been promised adventure, and ended up with a ship where every corner looked like it had been designed by engineers who secretly hated comfort. His crewmates, a ragtag group of overachievers and underachievers who collectively argued about everything from gravity calibration to the proper way to fold a spacesuit, had taken an immediate liking to him, which in practice meant endless jokes at his expense. "Hey Jalen," called Corin, the ship's navigator who had hair that seemed to defy gravity in ways no human should be allowed. "Don't trip on the anti-gravity mat again." We hate to explain to command why our exploration officer bounced into the fuel pods. Jalen grinned weakly and considered pretending he hadn't tripped the previous day, only to recall that he had, in fact, bounced across 3 meters of polished metal before slamming into a conveniently placed bulkhead, much to the amusement of an entire corridor of crew members. He had learned 2 things about this ship so far. 1, gravity was optional but embarrassment was mandatory. 2, he had a sense of humor that he was required to hide behind a helmet at all times. The mission had taken them to a crystalline planet orbiting a star that seemed far too polite to shine as brightly as it did. Sensors had indicated signs of intelligent life, which, according to protocol, meant they had to approach with both caution and dignity. Jalen, who had spent more time reading old Earth comics than learning interstellar etiquette, wasn't exactly brimming with either. He found himself wandering through the docking bay, admiring the way light fractured through the translucent walls, casting prismatic patterns across the floor, when the comm system crackled. "Prepare for atmospheric boarding," the captain's voice announced, and a robotic drone floated by, its single-camera eye swiveling as if judging him personally. Jalen waved awkwardly at it, and it beeped in a way he interpreted as polite confusion. "I swear I'm more qualified than I look," he muttered to no one, and a passing engineer snickered. The station orbiting the crystalline planet was unlike anything he had imagined. It hovered with a quiet confidence, a latticework of metal and glass, punctuated with softly glowing panels and what appeared to be floating gardens that defied gravity entirely. The scent of ozone mingled with something sweeter, a hint of alien flora that seemed to hum faintly underfoot. Jalen paused at the entrance, taking a deep breath, and immediately wished he hadn't. The doors swished open, revealing her. Celira stood in the center of the room, human in every obvious way but with a grace that seemed to bend physics around her. Her ears were long, tapering elegantly as if sculpted to catch the whispers of the universe, and they swayed gently when she moved. Her hair shimmered with an almost imperceptible glow, and her eyes, gold and violet swirling in impossible patterns, held him captive instantly. Jalen's first thought was, embarrassingly, that if eyes could be considered dangerous weapons, hers were loaded and aimed directly at him. He felt a strange tug at his chest, a mixture of fascination, fear, and a creeping realization that he had just met someone capable of undoing every preconceived notion he had about life, love, and perhaps the spatial safety protocols. He stepped forward, tried to look confident, and immediately tripped over the edge of a floating panel. His hands flailed, and he narrowly avoided colliding with a hovering holographic display of the planet's surface. Celira tilted her head, her long ears twitching slightly, and emitted a sound that made him freeze in mid-apology. It wasn't quite laughter, but it carried the same warmth and amusement. Jalen's words failed him. Instead, he mumbled, "I swear I meant to do that," and then cursed himself internally for even saying it. Celira's eyes crinkled at the corners, as if she were suppressing a smile, and she gestured toward a console with fluid precision that made him realize every motion of hers was both graceful and purposeful. Jalen followed, trying not to step on the shimmering gardens that floated like small moons around the chamber. As he fumbled with the controls, accidentally projecting a holographic chart of his own embarrassed history on the wall behind him, Celira's melodic laughter rang out again, echoing softly through the room. Jalen ducked, which only made him knock over a floating chair, and muttered, "I swear I'm qualified to be here." Celira, unfazed, extended a hand that glowed faintly at the fingertips. "You are," she said in her voice that somehow seemed to harmonize with the very hum of the station, "though it is charming how determined you are to deny it." Jalen blinked. She sounded like music he had never heard, yet somehow understood. "Right," he said, attempting to recover some shred of dignity. "Well, I guess I'll try not to embarrass myself further." He paused, then added with a nervous grin, "No promises, though." What? They spent the next hours navigating the station together, a dance of missteps and discoveries. Jalen learned that the floating gardens responded to emotion, subtly shifting colors when he felt nervous, which Celira found endlessly amusing. She taught him how to operate the gravitic lifts, only for him to accidentally send himself floating upside down across the atrium, prompting laughter from Celira that resonated so deeply it felt like it had shifted the stars themselves. Between the chaos, Jalen caught glimpses of her quiet moments, how she studied the patterns of the crystalline planet below, or how her long ears twitched ever so slightly when she concentrated, and he realized he was completely captivated. As the day faded and the planet's twin moons reflected off the station's glassy surface, Celira led Jalen to a quiet observation deck. They floated side by side in a delicate zero-gravity ballet, and for a moment, words weren't necessary. He could see stars mirrored in her eyes, and it was as if every unspoken thought, every potential joke, every awkward stumble had led him here. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I think I'm in trouble," he said. Celira's lips curved into a small smile. "I believe trouble suits you," she replied, and Jalen could swear the lights in the station dimmed just slightly, not from power fluctuation but from the sheer gravitational pull of her gaze. The chapter ended not with a dramatic crash or alien threat, but with the quiet, absurd human realization that he was falling, for an alien woman who could make stars feel warm, for her humor, for her long ears that twitched when she laughed, and for eyes that seemed to see not just him, but all the potential he had never dared to believe in. And somehow he thought that might just be the beginning of everything. Jalen woke to find himself floating gently against the observation deck wall, the faint hum of the station vibrating through the air like a soft heartbeat. He had fallen asleep mid-contemplation of Celira's eyes, which, for reasons he could not rationalize, seemed to linger in his mind even after hours had passed. He blinked, tried to push off the wall, and instead drifted headfirst toward a panel of blinking controls, narrowly missing it and letting out a small, sheepish curse. Gravity, or the lack thereof, had a way of making embarrassment a physical sensation, and Jalen was quickly becoming its most compliant subject. Celira entered without warning, gliding across the floor as though she had rehearsed every step in zero gravity for years. She hummed something that sounded like a scale of notes humans hadn't invented yet, and it seemed to make the entire deck respond, panels flickering in rhythm with her tune. "Good morning," she said, her ears swaying lazily like seaweed in a gentle current, "or whatever time your species claims it is." "Morning," Jalen said, straightening as best he could while still floating. "Is it, early, late?" "Intergalactic Standard Time." He waved his hands vaguely, which only propelled him in a small loop before he collided softly with a holographic display. Celira's eyes gleamed with amusement. "It is exactly the right time for breakfast." She extended a hand, and a small platform of luminescent food floated toward him. Jalen reached out, and the moment he touched a hovering orb of protein paste, it split into two smaller orbs as if sensing his nervousness. "It adapts to your taste," she explained, "or your panic. It seems the difference is negligible for you." He blinked, then grinned despite himself. "I see, very thoughtful of you." He bit the smallest of the orbs and was immediately assaulted with a burst of flavor that was neither sweet nor savory, but a combination that made his tongue feel both awake and confused. "Wow, okay, that's something."
What?
They ate, or rather experimented with eating, while floating side by side, occasionally bumping into each other with an awkward grace. Jalen realized quickly that every minor misstep, every accidental drift, was met with Celira's soft, musical laughter, which seemed to imbue the very air with warmth. He tried to focus on conversation to regain some human dignity. "So, your species, the one with the long ears and inexplicably musical voices, what do you do here normally, beyond floating gardens and edible mood orbs?"
What?
Celira tilted her head. "We explore patterns," she said simply, as if that explained everything, which it clearly did not. She floated closer, pointing at the planet below where crystalline structures glinted in the twin moons' reflection. "Patterns in energy, emotion, the resonance of matter. Sometimes it leads us to understanding, sometimes it leads us to adventure." Jalen nodded slowly, attempting to match her gravity-defying elegance. "Adventure," he repeated, and promptly drifted headfirst into a railing, knocking a small control panel off balance. "Right, definitely adventure." The day unfolded in a series of trials, both hilarious and instructive. Celira taught him how to navigate the station's zero-gravity gardens without turning them into debris fields, only for him to accidentally sneeze and send a cluster of floating luminescent plants tumbling toward the ceiling. "A minor setback," she said, eyes twinkling, "if you enjoy surprises." Jalen realized he was becoming an expert in graceful recovery, even if the universe, or at least the station, continued to conspire against him. By mid-cycle, Celira had introduced him to one of her favorite recreational devices, a gravity-altering trampoline, essentially a floor that bent local gravity vectors so that one could bounce across the chamber with an exhilarating lack of coordination. Jalen's first attempt sent him spinning like a confused comet, arms flailing as Celira glided effortlessly beside him, her long ears trailing in the air as if caught in a gentle cosmic wind. "You might consider less flailing, more trust," she said, amusement dancing in her gaze. "I'm trusting, sort of," Jalen shouted mid-spin, narrowly avoiding another collision with a floating workstation. Celira's laughter, harmonized with a low hum, seemed to bend the very light around them, and for a fleeting second, Jalen felt like he was not merely in space but suspended in a private corner of the universe, one where nothing could touch him except the gravity of her gaze. Later, while recovering on a small observation platform, they shared more intimate humor. Jalen confessed that he had spent decades reading about aliens in books and comics, only to discover that reality was infinitely stranger and infinitely more attractive than any story he had imagined. Celira countered with tales of her ancestors, who had once tried to teach constellations to humans for entertainment, only to conclude that humans were remarkably resilient to both cosmic insight and embarrassment. "You are a perfect combination of both," she said, leaning closer. The connection between them deepened subtly, not in grand gestures but in quiet discoveries, how Jalen reacted to the peculiar resonance of her laughter, how she noticed his gaze lingering on her long ears, and how shared humor, small, absurd, human and alien, formed a bridge across species. Even as alarms occasionally blared due to minor system malfunctions, their banter persisted, ranging from arguments over the best flavor of Mudorb food to Jalen's increasingly ridiculous attempts to navigate a zero-gravity corridor without spinning uncontrollably. As the planetary cycle shifted and the twin moons began to align, casting prismatic shadows across the station, Celira led him to a quiet observation nook. Gravity was restored just enough for them to stand or hover side by side. She gestured toward the planet, whose surface shimmered like liquid crystal. "The patterns today were unusual," she said softly, her ears twitching in a subtle rhythm. They spoke of unpredictability and laughter. "Perhaps the influence of a human companion is significant." Jalen laughed nervously. "Significant, huh? I like to think I'm more of a minor chaos agent, really." He caught himself, realizing the absurdity of admitting this to someone who could probably see the pattern of his heartbeat in the starlight. "But I'll take significant if that's the upgrade package." Celira tilted her head, a small smile curving her lips. "You are more remarkable than you realize," she said, and for the first time, Jalen didn't question the sincerity of an alien compliment. He found himself captivated not just by her eyes, which shimmered as though the stars themselves had lent her their light, but by the humor, the grace, and the unpredictable charm that seemed to define her existence. As they drifted there, suspended between the crystalline planet and the infinite dark of space, Jalen realized that the day had passed in a blur of floating gardens, accidental collisions, and shared laughter, and yet it had felt longer than a lifetime. He was learning slowly that the universe could be terrifying, ridiculous, and breathtakingly beautiful all at once, and that Celira, with her long ears and eyes that seemed to melt starlight, had rewritten his understanding of wonder. And somewhere deep inside, amid the laughter, the floating orbs, and the zero-gravity chaos, he understood the truth. Interstellar exploration was nothing compared to the adventure of connecting with someone who could see your soul, and who could make even the most ordinary moments feel like the edge of the cosmos. The alarm blared, a sharp, insistent wail that echoed through the corridors of the station. Jalen, who had spent the previous day learning the delicate art of floating without tripping over anything, immediately tripped over a support beam instead. "Of course," he muttered, untangling himself like a poorly tied knot, "it had to be now." Celira appeared in the doorway before he could even regain his balance, her long ears twitching in annoyance or amusement. Jalen could never quite tell. "It is more urgent than your breakfast mishaps," she said, and the faint hum of her voice seemed to bend the light around them, making even alarms feel like a gentle suggestion. Jalen followed, stumbling through zero-gravity corridors that had suddenly become chaotic mazes. The station's security panels flashed red, warning of approaching intruders. A rogue faction of alien mercenaries known for harvesting rare bioenergy from sentient species. Their target, as Jalen now realized with growing horror, was Celira and her kind. He swallowed. "And here I thought my biggest challenge would be not face-planting into a console." Celira floated beside him effortlessly, guiding him with a subtle tilt of her body. "You are more capable than you know," she said calmly, though her eyes flickered with urgency. "Your unpredictability may be useful." Jalen tried to muster a heroic nod, but the moment he did, his foot caught a low panel and sent him spinning into a gravitic lift. Salira reached out, her hand brushing his shoulder, and with a subtle flick of her fingers, she stabilized him mid-spin. "See, useful," she said, voice teasing, even in the middle of impending disaster. They reached the central hub just as the first of the mercenaries breached the station's outer docking ports. Jalen had seen holograms of their kind, sleek, predatory, and terrifyingly efficient, but seeing them in person, armed and moving like shadows across the crystalline corridors, was another matter entirely. He panicked slightly. Salira, now might be a good time for those pattern fighting lessons you mentioned." Salira smirked, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous and playful at once. "Consider them optional," she replied, and with a graceful motion she tapped a panel on the wall. Energy barriers hummed to life, flickering with a golden light. Jalen's eyes widened as the barriers shifted, creating mazes, traps, and unpredictable pathways. Optional, yes, but highly recommended. What followed was a chaotic ballet. Jalen discovered, almost by accident, that his clumsy improvisation could actually disrupt the mercenaries. He tripped, flipped, and sent floating panels spinning in unpredictable trajectories, each time inadvertently blocking a corridor or tripping up an attacker. Salira moved alongside him with fluid precision, manipulating energy fields with a flick of her fingers, her ears twitching like antennas tuned to the resonance of danger. She laughed once, a melodic sound that made Jalen's stomach twist in a mix of terror and awe. "You may be the most chaotic hero I have ever met," she said, and he swallowed, realizing she meant it as a compliment. Midway through, one mercenary cornered him near a gravitic control panel. Jalen, panicking, grabbed a floating orb of energy stabilization and accidentally launched it straight at the intruder. It bounced off the wall, ricocheted twice, and knocked the mercenary unconscious. Salira raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed. "Effective in a completely improbable way," she noted. The battle reached its climax when a large group of mercenaries attempted to breach the station's central biocore chamber. Salira and Jalen positioned themselves at the entrance. She whispered instructions, which he struggled to follow, occasionally spinning midair or bumping into floating consoles. But slowly, methodically, they began to gain control. Salira manipulated the station's gravitic fields while Jalen triggered panels and barriers in ways that defied both engineering and logic. Each mishap somehow worked in their favor, and soon, the mercenaries were disoriented, stumbling into traps and fields that Salira controlled with a delicate flick. Finally, the last intruder fell, stunned by a perfectly timed collision of floating equipment. Jalen floated there, panting, slightly singed, and entirely exhilarated. Salira drifted close, her long ears brushing against his shoulder. You did not fail," she said softly. "You improvised, you adapted, you grew." Jalen laughed shakily. "I feel like I should have been eaten or vaporized at least twice," he admitted, "and yet here we are." "What?" Salira's eyes, swirling gold and violet, met his. "Yes," she said, "here we are." And in that moment, Jalen understood that he had changed. The human who had once tripped over every obstacle, who had been uncertain, fearful, and clumsy, was no longer just a spectator in the cosmos. He had discovered courage not in perfection but in unpredictability, not in control but in trust, and not in solitude but in connection. They spent the aftermath navigating the slightly damaged but still magnificent station, fixing panels and stabilizing floating gardens. Jalen still tripped occasionally, causing a few minor explosions of confetti-like energy particles from the maintenance drones, and Salira laughed each time, her melodic humor lightening the lingering tension. They joked about their improvised heroics, and Jalen realized that humor could coexist with danger, that laughter could survive chaos, and that love, interstellar, improbable, impossible as it seemed, could thrive even in the heart of cosmic calamity. Later, on the observation deck, they floated together, side by side. The crystalline planet below shimmered in the twin moon's light, and the stars above winked as if acknowledging their improbable triumph. Jalen looked at Salira's long ears, the subtle glow in her hair, and most of all at her eyes, swirling with starlight and warmth, and he felt a sense of completeness he hadn't thought possible. "So," he said, voice soft, "does this mean we survived Chaos Day?" Salira laughed, and the sound was like sunlight dancing on metal. "You survived," she corrected. "We survived together." What? Jalen smiled, feeling the truth of it resonate deep.